There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, like a Tuesday evening or a half-empty coffee cup. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in through the quiet spaces, through the hesitations between words, through a look held a second too long. They are the moments that, in retrospect, become the load-bearing walls of your entire memory palace. If you were to remove them, the whole structure of who you are and who you became would collapse into a pile of meaningless dust. For me, that moment wore a worn gray sweatshirt, smelled faintly of rain and something that was just intrinsically him, and it stood in my doorway, casting a long shadow into the life I thought I was building. It was the moment the quiet ended, not with a shout, but with the deafening silence of a man who had nowhere else to go, and the sudden, terrifying realization that I was the only place he wanted to be. He was standing on my welcome mat, which was a lie, because it just said "the apartment," in a plain, blocky font. He looked as though he had been sculpted from the evening's gloom, his shoulders slumped, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans. His name was Liam, and for the better part of 3 years, he had been the central, unsolvable equation of my life. An equation I kept returning to in the quiet hours, turning it over and over, trying to find a variable I had missed, a solution that wouldn't require me to shatter the fragile piece of our friendship. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not now. I was in the process of leaving. I was wearing my good coat, the charcoal wool one he'd once said made me look like a character from a sad, beautiful black and white film. My keys were in my hand, their cold metal a small, solid anchor to the evening I had planned, an evening that was supposed to be a step away from him. I had a date. The words felt foreign and flimsy even in the privacy of my own mind. A date. A planned interaction with a stranger with the potential for connection, a ritual I hadn't engaged in for so long I wasn't sure I remembered the steps. I had mentioned it to Liam the night before. We were on the couch, a familiar geography of two bodies existing in parallel, our shoulders not quite touching, the space between us charged with years of unspoken things. We were watching some subtitled Scandinavian crime drama I couldn't follow, my attention fixed instead on the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in his hazel eyes. "I have a date tomorrow," I'd said, trying to make it sound like I was commenting on the weather, a simple, observable fact. The shift in the room was immediate and profound. It wasn't a sound, it was a subtraction of it. The air grew dense. Liam, who was always in some state of subtle motion, a tapping finger, a bouncing knee, went perfectly still. He didn't turn to look at me. He just stared at the screen, at the bleak, snowy landscapes and the grim-faced detectives, but I knew he wasn't seeing them anymore. He had gone somewhere else, somewhere deep inside himself, and the door had closed behind him. He said nothing. A few minutes later, he'd stood up, mumbled something about an early morning, and left, leaving the silence he'd created behind like a physical object in the room. And now here he was, having brought that same silence back with him, standing in my doorway as if he were the physical embodiment of a question mark. My own heart was a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. I could feel the thrum of it in my throat. "Liam?" I asked, and my voice sounded thin, a thread of sound in the thick quiet. "What are you doing here?" "I was just leaving." He looked up then, and his eyes were vast. They were oceans, and I felt the familiar, terrifying pull of their tide. There was a storm in them, a deep and churning turbulence that he usually kept hidden behind a carefully constructed wall of easy smiles and casual confidence. But the wall was gone. There was only the storm and a desperate, raw vulnerability that stole the air from my lungs. He didn't speak. He just held my gaze, and in that look, I saw a plea so profound it was almost a command. It was a look that said, "Don't go." It was a look that said, "I am lost, and you are my only landmark." It was a look that unraveled the careful knot of detachment I had spent the entire day tying. To understand the weight of him standing in my doorway, you have to understand the architecture of our friendship. It was a structure we had built together, beam by beam, over the course of 3 years. We'd met at a mutual friend's painfully loud housewarming party. I was in my natural habitat, pressed into a corner, nursing a beer, observing the social chaos through the detached lens of a photographer, which is what I was. I documented things. I captured moments. I was good at framing life, at finding the beauty in the overlooked details, but I was terrible at being in the picture. And then he'd appeared, breaking through the noise and the crowd like a ship cutting through a choppy sea. He was all light and energy, his laughter a warm, genuine sound that made people lean in. He was a consultant, a job that kept him in a perpetual state of motion, flying from city to city, solving problems for people who wore expensive suits. He was talking to a small group, his hands moving as he told a story, and I found myself lifting my camera, almost involuntarily, and taking a picture. It wasn't a great photograph, technically speaking. The lighting was bad, the focus a little soft. But it captured something true. It captured the precise moment his performative, public smile faltered for a fraction of a second, revealing a flicker of exhaustion, of loneliness, underneath. It was a look I recognized. It was a look I saw in the mirror. Later, he'd found his way to my corner. "You're the quiet one," he'd said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. I'd nodded, unsure what to say. "I'm Julian," was all I managed. "Liam," he'd replied, offering a hand. "I saw you taking a picture earlier." Of me? I'd felt a flush of embarrassment, expecting him to be annoyed, but his expression was just curious. "You looked tired," I'd said, the honesty surprising even myself. He'd blinked, and for a moment, the mask was gone again. "Yeah," he'd said, his voice softer. "I am." That was the beginning. It was a foundation built on a shared, unspoken weariness, a recognition of the cracks in each other's facades. Our friendship grew in the spaces between his travels. My apartment became his unofficial home base, the still point in his turning world. He had his own place, a sterile, modern condo across town that always felt more like a hotel suite than a home, but he rarely seemed to be there. He'd show up at my door with takeout and a bottle of wine, fresh from the airport, his tie loosened, the scent of recycled airplane air still clinging to him. "Just got back," he'd say. "Mind if I crash here for a bit?" And I never minded. I would listen to his stories of boardrooms and PowerPoint presentations, of airport lounges and rental cars, and he would, in turn, listen to me talk about the chemical reactions in my darkroom, about the way light bent around a subject, about the stories I was trying to tell with my photographs. We were a study in contrasts. He was the sound, I was the silence. He was the motion, I was the stillness. And yet we fit. We made a strange kind of sense. For me, the shift from friendship to something more was a slow, creeping dawn. There was no single moment of revelation. It was more like developing a photograph in the darkroom, watching the image emerge gradually from the blank paper. It was in the way my stomach would tighten when I heard his specific knock on the door. It was in the way I found myself saving articles or funny videos I knew he would like, little offerings to place at the altar of his attention. It was in the ache I felt in the quiet of my apartment after he'd left, the space he had occupied still holding the echo of his presence, the ghost of his warmth. The final, undeniable image snapped into focus one night about a year into our friendship. He had fallen asleep on my couch, exhausted after a brutal week of travel. The television was murmuring, casting a flickering blue light across his face. His features, usually so animated, were soft and peaceful in sleep. One arm was dangling off the edge of the sofa, his fingers curled loosely. A stray lock of brown hair had fallen across his forehead, and I was struck by a wave of tenderness so profound it was painful. It was a fierce, protective, overwhelming urge to smooth the hair from his forehead, to tuck a blanket around his shoulders, to guard his sleep. And in that moment, I knew that the careful lines I had drawn around my heart had been breached. I knew that I was in love with my friend. And I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and heavy as a stone, that telling him would mean the end of everything. So I kept my secret locked away, a delicate, dangerous thing I would take out and examine only in the darkest, most private hours of the night. This fragile equilibrium, this carefully managed system of unspoken rules and controlled distances, was maintained for another 2 years. It was a quiet, sometimes lonely, existence, but it was stable. I had his friendship, and I had convinced myself that it was enough. It had to be. The alternative, losing him completely, was unthinkable. And then, Amelia broke up with him. Amelia, his girlfriend of 5 years, a woman I had met only a handful of times, who had always seemed to me like a beautifully rendered but ultimately two-dimensional character in the story of his life. He had never talked about her with the same passion he talked about a difficult work project or a new city he'd explored. Their relationship seemed to be one of convenience and history, a comfortable habit he'd never thought to question. Her departure, however, was not convenient. It was a demolition. He called me from his car, parked outside her building. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual warmth and cadence. "She's gone, Jules. She packed her things." She said it was like living with a ghost. There was a long pause, filled with the static of his shock. Can I come over?" He didn't need to ask. 20 minutes later, he was standing in my living room, looking small and lost in the space he usually filled with so much life. He wasn't crying. He seemed beyond tears, in a state of pure, distilled shock. He didn't want to talk about it. He just sank onto my couch, pulled a throw blanket over himself, and stared at the blank television screen. I made him tea, which he didn't drink. I sat in the armchair opposite him, keeping a silent vigil, feeling utterly useless. After an hour of this suffocating silence, he looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Can I just stay here tonight? I can't. I can't go back to my place. It's too quiet." That was the shift. That was the moment the tectonic plates of our friendship began to grind against each other, creating a new, uncertain landscape. Before, my apartment had been a pleasant stopover, a port in a minor storm. Now, it became his sanctuary, his only safe harbor. The breakup wasn't a simple catalyst. It was a detonation that shattered the public-facing version of Liam, the confident, easygoing consultant. What was left was something quieter, more fragile, and profoundly lonely. And he brought all of it to my door. He stayed on the couch that first night, and the night after that. He would leave for work in the morning, dressed in his crisp suits, the armor of his professional life, and he would return in the evening, shedding it at the door, seeming to shrink back into the wounded man who didn't want to be alone. Our evenings developed a new rhythm, a new ritual. We would eat in comfortable silence, watch movies I knew he wasn't paying attention to, and I would read while he just was. He was a presence, a weight in the room that was both a comfort and a constant, humming source of anxiety for me. The first time he crossed the physical boundary between the couch and my bed, it was disguised as a complaint. About 3 weeks into this new arrangement, I woke up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water. As I passed the living room, I saw him sitting up on the sofa, rubbing his neck. "This couch is killing me," he whispered into the darkness, his voice rough with sleep. "I feel like I'm 100 years old." I felt a pang of guilt, mixed with a sudden, sharp spike of panic. "You can take my bed," I offered, the words automatic. "I can sleep out here." He shook his head, a gesture barely visible in the gloom. "No, don't be ridiculous. It's your bed." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with something unspoken. It's big enough for two, isn't it?" My heart stopped. It literally felt like it seized in my chest, a sudden, painful clench. The air thickened, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. This was it. A door was opening, a door I had been staring at for years, a door I never thought he would even approach, let alone knock on. I had two choices. I could close it, make an excuse, insist he take the bed alone, maintain the safe and painful distance. Or I could open it and step into the terrifying, unknown space on the other side. "Yeah," I heard myself say, my voice a stranger's. "It is." He stood up, and the sound of his footsteps following me down the short hallway to my bedroom was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I got into my side of the bed, my body rigid, my muscles coiled like springs. I lay on my very edge of the mattress, trying to take up as little space as possible, holding my breath. He slid in on the other side, the mattress dipping with his weight. The distance between us was a chasm, a vast, empty space filled with my thundering heartbeat. "Thanks, Jules," he murmured into the dark. Then, silence. I lay awake for hours, hyper-aware of his presence, of the warmth radiating from his body just inches from mine, and I felt like I was going to be torn apart by the sheer force of my own hope. That night established the new ritual. The couch was tacitly abandoned. His excuse, once offered, was never needed again. Every night he stayed. He would simply follow me to my bedroom when I went to turn in. We didn't talk about it. It became another unspoken rule of our new reality. We were two men who shared a bed, but we existed on separate islands, a few feet of cotton sheet the ocean between us. I would lie on my side, facing away from him, my back a rigid wall of self-control. I would listen to the sound of his breathing, charting its course from the shallow rhythm of wakefulness to the deep, slow cadence of sleep. Only then, when I was sure he was lost to the world, would I allow myself to relax. Only then would I allow myself to feel the simple, profound comfort of his presence beside me. The ritual evolved. The island of his body began to drift closer to mine in the night. It started with a hand. I woke one morning to find his hand resting on the sliver of mattress between our backs. It wasn't touching me, not yet, but it was a clear violation of the demilitarized zone we had established. I lay perfectly still, my breathing shallow, my mind racing. Was he awake? Did he know? I feigned sleep until I heard his alarm, and when I finally dared to move, his hand was gone. But the ghost of its presence remained. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, his fingers brushed against the fabric of my t-shirt. It was a touch as light as a moth's wing, but it sent a jolt through my entire nervous system. I didn't flinch. I didn't breathe. I simply absorbed the contact, letting the warmth of his skin seep through the thin cotton, a tiny point of contact that felt as significant as the merging of continents. Then came the turning. I had grown accustomed to us sleeping back to back, two parallel lines that never intersected. But one night, deep in the coldest part of winter, I was woken by a shift in the bed. Liam, who I had assumed was sound asleep, turned over. The movement was slow, deliberate, and then an arm was draping over my waist. It was a heavy, warm weight, and it anchored me to the mattress. His body pressed against my back, his chest to my shoulder blades, his legs tangling with mine. He tucked his face into the space between my neck and my shoulder, and his breath was a warm, steady puff against my skin. My entire body went into lockdown. Every muscle tensed. My mind screamed at me, a high-pitched siren of panic and disbelief. He's asleep. One part of my brain reasoned desperately. He doesn't know what he's doing. It's just a reflex. He's seeking warmth. But another, more treacherous part of me, the part that had been starved for this for years, whispered, "But what if he does?" I lay there for what felt like an eternity, trapped by the weight of his arm and the terrifying implications of his closeness. The scent of him was overwhelming. The clean, simple smell of his shampoo, and something else, something uniquely Liam, a scent I would have recognized in a crowded room, blindfolded. I forced myself to breathe. In, out. I tried to catalog the sensations with the detached precision of my photographer's eye. The pressure of his chest against my back. The solidness of his thigh against mine. The soft tickle of his breath on my neck. I was documenting the moment, trying to file it away as data, but it was useless. This wasn't data. This was fire. This was a slow, creeping burn that was melting away all my defenses. Eventually, exhaustion won out over anxiety, and I drifted back into a fitful sleep, wrapped in his arms, feeling both safer and more in danger than I had ever felt in my life. This became the new, unspoken apex of our nightly ritual. It didn't happen every night. Some nights, we remained on our separate islands. But on the nights it did happen, it was always the same. He would wait until he thought I was asleep, and then he would turn, and he would hold me. I became a master of feigning sleep, of controlling the rhythm of my breathing, of keeping my body still when every nerve ending was screaming. It was a strange, agonizing kind of performance. I was playing the role of the oblivious friend, while inside, I was a tumultuous sea of yearning and fear. I analyzed every movement, every sigh. Was the pressure of his hand on my hip a little firmer tonight? Did he hold me a little longer this morning before pulling away? It was a form of madness, trying to divine the intentions of a sleeping man. I was a cartographer, trying to map a country that disappeared every morning at the first light of dawn. The days were almost as difficult as the nights. The intimacy we shared in the darkness vanished in the light. In the morning, we would move around the small kitchen, making coffee, careful not to bump into each other. The vast, charged space of the bed was replaced by the careful, polite distance of the breakfast table. We would talk about the weather, about work, about anything other than the fact that we had spent the night with our limbs tangled together. Liam would be cheerful, almost aggressively normal, as if to compensate for the strangeness of the nights. He would thank me for the coffee, grab his briefcase, and head out the door, leaving me alone in the apartment, my head spinning with confusion. Was I imagining it all? Was I so desperate for a sign that I was manufacturing one out of subconscious movements and a lonely man's need for warmth? I felt like I was living in two separate realities, the chaste, platonic world of daylight and the deeply, terrifyingly intimate world of the night. And the effort of navigating between the two was starting to wear me down. My darkroom became my only refuge from the confusion. The process was grounding, a series of concrete steps with a predictable outcome. The smell of the chemicals, the satisfying click of the enlarger, the magical moment an image bloomed to life in the developer tray. It was a world I could control. I started a new series of photographs, portraits not of people, but of empty spaces. A rumpled bedsheet holding the impression of a body. A single coffee mug left on a countertop. The empty space on a couch. They were photographs of absence, of the ghost of a presence. They were, I realized with a jolt one afternoon, all photographs of Liam. I was documenting the space he occupied in my life, trying to capture the shape of his impact on my world, because I was terrified that one day he would be gone, and these images, these echoes, would be all I had left. The breaking point, when it came, was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, internal decision. I had been living in this state of suspended animation for nearly 6 months. Liam was still grieving, still healing from his breakup, but he was also getting better. The raw shock had faded, replaced by a more manageable melancholy. He was laughing more, his old self peeking through the cracks in his sadness. And I knew, with a sinking feeling, that my apartment, my bed, my presence, was a transitional space for him. I was a hospital, a place for convalescence. And sooner or later, the patient would be well enough to leave. The thought of him leaving, of the nights returning to their empty silence, was unbearable. But the thought of continuing this nightly charade, this agonizing dance of feigned obliviousness, was equally impossible. It was hollowing me out. The date was an act of self-preservation. A friend from a weekly photography collective had been trying to set me up with his cousin, a landscape architect named David. For weeks, I had politely demurred. But now, the idea of it felt like a lifeline. It was a way to prove to myself that there was a world outside the four walls of my apartment, a world that did not revolve around the sleeping habits of Liam. It was a way to take a single, concrete step in a different direction, to remind my own heart that it was, in fact, my own, and not some satellite perpetually orbiting his. So I said yes. I agreed to have dinner with a man I had never met, and the act of making the plan felt like a small rebellion. And so I told him. I told Liam about the date as he sat on my couch, the same couch where he had first collapsed in his grief all those months ago. I watched the stillness descend upon him, the way the light seemed to drain from his eyes. I saw the subtle tightening of his jaw. He didn't say, "Don't go," he didn't say, "What about us?" He said nothing at all. He just absorbed the information, and it seemed to add a visible weight to his shoulders. His early departure that night was not a retreat. It felt like a surrender. He left, and I was left with the echoing silence and the bitter taste of a victory I wasn't sure I wanted. I spent the next day in a state of anxious dread. I half expected him to call, to text, to say something, anything. But my phone remained silent. The quiet from his end was so complete, so absolute. It was like a physical force. It pressed in on me, and with every passing hour, my resolve wavered. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I had finally pushed him away for good. By 7 o'clock, I had showered and dressed, moving on autopilot. I put on the charcoal wool coat. I picked up my keys. I was going to go through with it. I was going to walk out that door and have dinner with David the landscape architect, and I was going to be charming and engaged. I was going to perform the role of a person who was not being slowly dismantled by hope and confusion. I was going to pretend to be normal. I opened my front door, the cool air of the hallway a sudden shock to my skin. And there he was. He hadn't knocked. He was just standing there, as if he had materialized from the shadows. And we were back at the beginning of this story, at the moment where everything tilted on its axis. He stood in my doorway, and the entire, complicated history of our friendship, of our shared nights, of my secret love and his unspoken need, hung in the air between us. He was the embodiment of every question I was too afraid to ask. "Liam," I said again, just as I had in my memory of the moment, my voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" He took a step forward, crossing the threshold from the hallway into my apartment, into my space. He gently took the keys from my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. The brief touch was an electric shock. He placed the keys on the small table by the door, a definitive, deliberate gesture. And then he looked at me, his eyes dark with an emotion I couldn't name. It was fear, yes, but there was something else there, too. A fierce, desperate resolve. "Don't go," he said. His voice was raw, scraped clean of any artifice. It was the two most terrifying and beautiful words I had ever heard. My date was with a man named David. He was waiting at a restaurant downtown. My phone was in my pocket. I could send a text. I could apologize. I could reschedule. I could salvage the evening, salvage my attempt at moving on. All I had to do was pick up my keys, turn my back on Liam, and walk out the door. It would be the sensible thing to do. It would be the safe thing to do. It would be the thing a person who valued their own sanity would do. But as I looked at him, at the wreckage and the hope in his eyes, I knew that sanity was no longer the primary consideration. For years, I had been an observer, a man behind a camera, documenting life from a safe distance. I had built a fortress of self-protection around my heart, and its walls were silence and observation. Liam was standing in the gateway, asking to be let in, and I knew, with a sudden, breathtaking clarity, that the greatest risk was not in letting him in, but in turning him away. I took a breath. "Okay," I said. Just one word. But it was enough. It was the sound of a lock turning, of a bolt being drawn back. The tension in Liam's shoulders seemed to dissolve. The storm in his eyes didn't vanish, but the violent crashing of the waves seemed to quiet into a deep, powerful swell. He didn't smile. Relief didn't wash over his face. Instead, his expression became even more vulnerable, as if my agreement had stripped away his last layer of defense. He took another step closer, so we were standing just inches apart. The air between us was electric, humming with everything we had never said. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could see the tiny, frantic pulse beating in the hollow of his throat. He raised a hand, his movements slow, tentative, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. He didn't touch my face. Instead, his fingers gently brushed against the lapel of my wool coat, the one he liked. He traced the edge of the fabric, his gaze fixed on the simple movement. It was an unbearably tender gesture. It was an apology and a question all at once. My own hands were at my sides, clenched into fists. I was fighting every instinct that screamed at me to reach out, to pull him closer, to end this agonizing suspense. I had to let him lead. This had to be his choice, his journey out of the fog. I had to stand still and be the landmark he was navigating by. "Jules," he whispered, his voice cracking on my name. He finally lifted his gaze from my coat to my eyes. "I'm sorry for what?" I asked, my own voice just as quiet. "For all of it," he said, a wave of something, frustration, confusion, self-recrimination, passing over his face. "For the couch. For your bed. For just showing up. For being a mess. For not talking." He shook his head, looking down again. "When you said you had a date, I felt like the floor had just dropped out from under me. And I didn't understand why. It was just a date. You're allowed to have a date. It's what people do. But the thought of you, walking out that door, with someone else." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He took a shaky breath. "I went home last night, and my apartment was so empty. It wasn't just quiet. It was empty. And I realized it's been empty for a long time. And your place, this place, isn't. It's not empty. And it's not because of the furniture or the photos on the wall. It's because you're here." He looked up at me again, and his eyes were glistening. The storm had finally broken. "I think," he said, his voice barely audible, "I think I've been so stupid, Julian." And then, he asked the question that changed everything. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a confident move. It was the most vulnerable sound I had ever heard. "Would it be okay?" he breathed, the words hanging in the small space between us like fragile glass ornaments. "If I kissed you?" The world stopped. The sound of traffic outside my window faded away. The hum of the refrigerator ceased. There was only his question and the frantic, hopeful beating of my own heart. For years, I had dreamed of this, in a vague, hazy, impossible way. I had imagined 100 different scenarios, 100 different ways this might happen. None of them were like this. None of them were this quiet, this tentative, this beautifully, achingly real. He wasn't grabbing me in a fit of passion. He was asking for permission. He was acknowledging the history, the friendship, the risk. He was laying his heart bare in my hallway and trusting me not to step on it. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. My throat was too tight. Instead, I just nodded, a small, jerky movement. It was all the answer he needed. He leaned in, closing the final inch of distance between us. His lips met mine, and it was not a kiss of passion or of pent-up desire. It was a kiss of discovery. It was soft, hesitant, questioning. It tasted of salt and rain and a deep, profound relief. It was the feeling of a long-lost traveler finally coming home. I felt the tension drain out of my body, the fists at my sides finally unclenching. I brought my hands up and rested them on his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his sweatshirt. He responded by deepening the kiss just slightly, his hand coming up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. It was a confession. It was an answer. It was the end of the silence and the beginning of everything else. We stood there in my entryway for a long time, in the space between the world outside and the world we had created inside my apartment. The kiss ended, but we didn't pull apart. He rested his forehead against mine, and we just breathed together, sharing the same air. The wool of my coat was bunched up under his hands. My own hands were tracing the seams of his sweatshirt. The silence that returned was not the heavy, anxious silence of before. It was a new kind of silence. It was peaceful. It was full. It was the comfortable, settled quiet of a question that has finally been answered. But the morning after a miracle is still just a Tuesday. The euphoria of that moment in the hallway could not last forever. It was a beautiful, perfect snow globe, and the dawn, with its harsh, ordinary light, was the shake that sent all the perfect little flakes into a chaotic swirl. I woke up first. Liam was still asleep, his arm thrown protectively over my chest, his face relaxed and peaceful. For a moment, I allowed myself to just watch him, to believe that this was real, that this was our new reality. The memory of the kiss, of his whispered question, was a warm glow in my chest. But as the sun streamed in through the blinds, casting stripes of light across the bed, a cold tendril of anxiety began to creep in. What now? What did this mean? Liam woke up slowly, blinking against the light. He saw me watching him, and for a split second, a soft, sleepy smile touched his lips. And then, memory seemed to flood in. The smile vanished. His eyes widened slightly. He pulled his arm back as if he had been burned. He sat up, running a hand through his already messy hair, and he wouldn't look at me. The beautiful, full silence of the night before was gone, replaced by a tense, awkward quiet that was 1,000 times worse than the silence we had before. "Morning," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, trying to pretend my heart wasn't sinking into my stomach. "Yeah, morning," he mumbled, his voice thick. He swung his legs out of bed, his back to me. I should get going. I have that thing. For work." He was already pulling on the jeans he'd discarded on the floor, moving with a frantic, clumsy energy. He was running. He was a flight risk, and my entire apartment had just become the airport. "Liam," I said, my voice firmer now. "Stop." He froze, his hand on the doorknob of my bedroom. But he still wouldn't turn around. "What are you doing?" I asked, and the hurt was starting to bleed into my voice. "I don't know," he said, and his voice was a tight, strangled thing. "I don't know, Jules. I'm sorry. Last night. I shouldn't have. It was a mistake. The word landed in the quiet room like a stone. It shattered the beautiful, fragile thing we had built. It was a negation of everything. The kiss, the question, the feeling of rightness. All of it, dismissed as a mistake. I felt a hot, sharp anger mix with the cold dread. I had spent years protecting my heart from this exact wound, and he had just inflicted it with 2 careless words. I had let him in, and he was trying to burn the house down on his way out. "A mistake," I said, and my voice was dangerously quiet. "Was it a mistake when you asked me if you could kiss me? Was it a mistake when you told me this was the only place that didn't feel empty? Which part was the mistake, Liam? Be specific. I want to know." He finally turned around, and his face was a mask of panic and confusion. He looked cornered. "All of it," he said, his voice rising. I'm just out of a relationship. I was lonely. I was confused. You were there. And you were going on a date. And I panicked. It's not fair to you. I don't know what I'm doing. I've never. This isn't me. Those 3 words hurt more than it was a mistake. He was drawing a line, not just between us, but between the man he thought he was and the man who had held me in his arms all night. He was disowning the part of himself that had reached for me. He was trying to shove all of that beautiful, terrifying vulnerability back into a box and nail the lid shut. And he was using my heart for a hammer. He left. He mumbled another, "I'm sorry," and fled my apartment, leaving the door hanging open in his wake. I sat on the edge of my bed, in the wreckage of the morning, and I listened to his footsteps fading down the hall until there was nothing. The silence he left behind this time was not empty. It was full of pain. It was full of the ghosts of his excuses and the sharp, jagged edges of my own broken hope. I had taken the risk. I had opened the door, and I had been left alone in the ruins. The next 2 days were a special kind of hell. A silent hell. I didn't hear from him. I didn't expect to. I moved through my apartment like a ghost, the memory of him everywhere. The dent in the couch cushion. The mug he used for coffee still by the sink. The empty space in my bed, which now felt like a vast, cold wasteland. I developed the photos I had taken, the ones of the empty spaces. Looking at them now, they felt prophetic. They were no longer about his presence. They were about his absence. The pain was a physical thing, a dull, heavy ache in my chest. It was the grief of a loss that was all the more painful because the thing I was mourning had only been real for a few perfect, fleeting hours. I was angry, but underneath the anger was a deep, profound hurt. He had seen my vulnerability, my love, which I had guarded for so long, and he had been terrified by it. He had called it a mistake. He had used his breakup and his confusion as a shield, and in doing so, he had invalidated not just the kiss, but our entire intimacy. The nightly ritual, the cuddling, the shared bed. In his panicked morning-after narrative, all of it was recast as the unfortunate side effects of his emotional turmoil, and I was just the collateral damage. The quiet observer who got too close to the subject and got burned. On the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was going to drive me mad. The ambiguity had returned, but now it was laced with poison. I had to know. I had to have the final, painful truth, even if it destroyed me. Because living in this limbo, this space of what-ifs and recriminations, was not living at all. I put on my shoes, grabbed my keys, and walked out of my apartment. I drove to his sterile condo across town, the one that felt like a hotel. I didn't know what I was going to say. I had no plan. I was just a raw nerve, a walking wound, heading toward the source of its pain, because that was the only way to begin the process of healing. I stood outside his door, my heart pounding a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I raised my hand to knock and hesitated. What if he wasn't there? What if he was there and he didn't open the door? What if he opened the door and I saw pity in his eyes? I took a deep breath and I knocked. The sound was loud in the quiet, carpeted hallway. I waited. A minute stretched into an eternity. I was about to turn away, to retreat, when I heard the sound of locks turning. The door opened a few inches, and he was there, looking like a ghost. He was still in his pajamas, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. His hair was a mess. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He looked as miserable as I felt. "Julian," he breathed, his voice hoarse. "We need to talk," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. I was too tired for emotion. "Can I come in?" He nodded numbly and stepped back, letting me into the space he called home. It was just as I remembered it. Cold, impersonal, stylish in a way that had no personality. There were takeout containers on the counter and a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. The air was stale. This was not the apartment of a man who was relieved to have escaped a mistake. This was the apartment of a man who was hiding. I didn't sit down. I turned to face him in the middle of the living room. "I'm only going to say this once, Liam," I began, my voice gaining a strength I didn't know I had. "So, I need you to listen. For 3 years, you have been the best friend I have ever had. And for almost that entire time, I have been in love with you. I never said anything, because I valued your friendship more than my own feelings. I was willing to live with that silence forever, to keep you in my life in whatever capacity I could." I took a breath, keeping my gaze locked on his. He looked like he wanted to disappear. "Then, your world fell apart, and you came to me. And I was there. I let you into my home, into my space, into my life, in a way I have never let anyone in. And the lines started to blur. I let them blur. I let you sleep in my bed. I let you hold me in the night. And I told myself you were just grieving, that you were just lonely, that it meant nothing. I told myself that, over and over, because it was less painful than the hope that it might mean something. Tears were starting to prick at my eyes, but I blinked them back. I would not cry. Not yet. And then, you kissed me. I continued, my voice low and intense. You asked, and then you kissed me. And for a few hours, I let myself believe that it was real, that it wasn't just me. And then you called it a mistake. You ran away, and you called it a mistake, and you broke my heart, Liam. You broke it in a way that no one else has ever been able to. I finally paused, my chest heaving. He was just staring at me, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. His face was a canvas of guilt and misery. So this is what I need from you now, I said, my voice softening slightly. I need the truth. Not the panicked, scared animal truth you gave me the other morning. The real truth. If all of this, the nights, the kiss, all of it, if it was just a mistake for you, if it was just a side effect of your own pain and confusion, you have to tell me. You owe me that. You owe me the honesty to tell me that I mean nothing to you in that way, so that I can finally close this door and start to figure out how to live with that. I will survive it. I will. But I cannot survive this ghost of a thing that you've left me with. I cannot survive the ambiguity anymore. So please, Liam, just tell me the truth. I had said my piece. I had laid my heart, my anger, my pain, all of it, out on the cold, sterile floor of his apartment. There was nothing left to say. The silence that followed was different yet again. It was a waiting silence. A precipice. His next words would either be the thing that pushed me over the edge or the hand that pulled me back to safety. He finally moved, sinking onto the edge of his pristine sofa as if his legs could no longer support him. He buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake. A choked, ragged sob escaped him. It was a sound of such utter despair that it broke through my anger and my pain and went straight to the part of me that still loved him. Despite everything, my first instinct was to go to him, to comfort him. But I held my ground. This was his to fix. After a long moment, he looked up, his face streaked with tears. It wasn't a mistake, he whispered, his voice shattered. The mistake was calling it one. The mistake was running. The mistake was being a coward. He took a shuddering breath. I've spent my whole life being the guy who has it all figured out. The consultant. The problem solver. I have a plan for everything. And then you. You don't fit into any of my plans. You don't fit into the story I've been telling myself about who I am. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. When Amelia left, she said I was a ghost. And she was right. I was never really there, not completely. I was always holding a part of myself back. And when I was with you, in your apartment, I didn't have to. I could just be. I didn't have to perform. And the nights, sleeping next to you. He trailed off, shaking his head. At first, I told myself it was just about comfort, that I was just lonely. But then, I would wake up in the middle of the night, and I would be holding you. And I would be awake, Jules. I wasn't asleep. And I would lie there, and I would feel this peace. This feeling of being in exactly the right place. And it terrified me, because it felt more real than anything I had ever felt with her, or with anyone. He stood up and took a hesitant step toward me. When you said you had a date, it was like a physical blow. The thought of another man in your life, of you building something with someone else, it was like I couldn't breathe. And I didn't know why. And then I showed up at your door, and I was going to beg you not to go, and I didn't even know why I was doing it. I just knew I had to. And then I kissed you, and it was like everything clicked into place. It was the most honest thing I think I've ever done in my life. Then why did you run? I asked, my voice soft. Because I'm an idiot, he said, a sad, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. Because that honesty scared the hell out of me. It meant that my whole life, the whole path I thought I was on, was wrong. It meant admitting that the one thing, the one person, that felt like home, was you. And I didn't know what to do with that. So I panicked. I said the cruelest thing I could think of to push you away, because I was terrified of how much I needed you not to be pushed. He was standing in front of me now, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The last 3 days, being here, alone, in this empty place, it's been the worst 3 days of my life. Because the only thing I wanted to do was run back to you. And I didn't think you'd have me. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between us. It wasn't a mistake, Julian. Loving you, or starting to realize I might love you, it's the only thing that's felt real in years. I am so sorry that I hurt you. I was scared. I'm still scared. But I think I think I'm more scared of losing you. The dam inside me finally broke. A single tear tracked its way down my cheek, and he reached out and gently wiped it away with his thumb. His touch was hesitant, but his eyes were clear. The fog of his confusion had finally lifted. I leaned into his touch, and a long, shuddering sigh escaped me. The tension, the anger, the fear I had been carrying for days, for years, finally began to recede. I'm scared too, I admitted, my voice a whisper. Good, he said, a small, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. Then we can be scared together. And in the middle of his cold, impersonal living room, surrounded by the evidence of his lonely despair, he wrapped his arms around me. And I held on to him, burying my face in his shoulder, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. It wasn't a neat and tidy ending. It was a messy, painful, beautiful beginning. We didn't go back to my place right away. We stayed at his, and we talked. For hours. We sat on his uncomfortable designer sofa, and we dismantled the silence we had lived in for so long, brick by brick. He told me about the pressure he'd always felt to follow a certain path, the successful career, the appropriate girlfriend, the life that looked good on paper. He talked about the loneliness that had been his constant companion on the road, a loneliness that his relationship with Amelia had never been able to touch. And I talked too. I told him about the first time I knew I loved him, watching him sleep on my couch. I told him about the ache of his presence and absence, about the madness of trying to interpret his every move. We laid our fears and our vulnerabilities out between us, and they were no longer terrifying monsters, but small, manageable things we could hold in our hands. That evening, we ordered a pizza and ate it sitting on the floor because it felt less formal than his dining table. We didn't touch much. It was as if, after the storm, we needed to relearn how to exist in the same space, this time with intention. The occasional brush of our hands as we both reached for a slice was no longer charged with ambiguity, but with a quiet, certain tenderness. Later, when it was time to sleep, we went to his room, to his bed, which felt as strange and foreign as the rest of his apartment. We lay down on our respective sides, the space between us a respectful distance. For a long while, we were both silent. Jules, he said into the darkness. Yeah. Can I hold you? He asked, and the question was just as vulnerable, just as precious, as it had been the first time he'd asked to kiss me. Yes, I said. Please, he turned, and I turned to meet him. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close, and I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. There was no pretense of sleep. There was no ambiguity. It was just us, awake, choosing to be close. It was a conscious act of comfort and connection, and as I drifted off to sleep, feeling the rise and fall of his chest beneath my cheek, I knew that this was the real beginning of our new normal. The next morning, we drove back to my apartment together. Walking through the door felt different. It was no longer just my sanctuary. It was becoming our space. He had brought a small overnight bag with him, a tangible symbol that this was not a temporary visit. He was here to stay. We made coffee, moving around each other in the small kitchen with a new, easy grace. The charged ness was gone, replaced by a comfortable intimacy. He stood behind me as I waited for the coffee to brew, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. It was a simple, domestic gesture, but it felt more profound than any passionate embrace. It was the gesture of a partner. It was the gesture of someone who belonged. The days that followed were a process of gentle discovery. We were learning a new language together, a language of open affection and spoken needs. The rituals of our past were not erased, but they were transformed. The nights in my bed were no longer a source of anxiety. Cuddling was not a mysterious, one-sided act, but a mutual seeking of comfort and warmth. He would trace patterns on my back as we talked late into the night, and I would no longer have to pretend to be asleep. I could turn and kiss him, and his lips would be ready to meet mine. We created new rituals. The morning coffee became a sacred time. He would sit at the kitchen table and tell me about his dreams while I worked in my darkroom, and he would no longer be just a subject of my art, but a participant in its creation. He'd come in, his eyes adjusting to the dim red light, and he'd watch, fascinated, as an image of a landscape we had visited together emerged in the chemical bath. You see things differently, he said one afternoon, his voice full of wonder. "You make the world more beautiful," and I knew he wasn't just talking about the photographs. The fear didn't vanish overnight. There were moments of insecurity, ghosts of our old dynamic that would flicker at the edges of our new happiness. Sometimes I would catch myself analyzing a look or a touch, falling back into the old habit of the quiet observer. And sometimes I would see a flicker of the old panic in his eyes, a moment of fear as he navigated this new, uncharted territory of his own heart. But now we could talk about it. "You're doing that thing," he would say gently, "where you go quiet and disappear into your own head." And I would take a breath and tell him what I was afraid of. And he would listen, and he would reassure me. And I would do the same for him. One evening, a few weeks into this new life, we were lying on the couch, my head in his lap, his fingers gently carding through my hair. We were watching another Scandinavian crime drama, but this time, I was actually following the plot. It was a comfortable, peaceful silence. Then Liam spoke. "I canceled my lease," he said, his voice soft. I sat up, looking at him. "My lease on the condo," he clarified. "It's up at the end of the month. I'm not renewing it." He looked at me, a question in his eyes, but it was a question full of confidence, not fear. "I was hoping maybe I could move my stuff in here." I smiled, a wide, genuine smile that reached my eyes. "I think we can find some room for you," I said. It was a simple, logistical conversation, but it was the most important one we had ever had. It was the sound of him closing the door on his old life, on the empty, sterile space that represented his loneliness, and choosing to build a home with me. The greatest structures are not built of stone and steel. They are built of moments. They are built of shared silences, of whispered questions, of the courage to be vulnerable. Our love story was not a grand, sweeping epic. It was a quiet, domestic one. It was a story about two people learning to heal, not just from their own individual wounds, but from the wounds they had inadvertently inflicted on each other in the process of finding their way. It was a story about the profound peace of finding a home in another person, of discovering that the safest harbor in any storm is the arms of someone who sees you, truly sees you, and chooses to stay. We had navigated the treacherous waters of ambiguity and fear, and we had found our way to a quiet shore. And there, in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we began to build our life.